The glint of the polished silver fork in my son's hand reflected the opulent chandelier above, 1,000 tiny diamonds winking back at me. He speared a briny oyster, its pearlescent sheen a stark contrast to the gnawing emptiness in my own stomach. This wasn't just any restaurant. This was the Gilded Spoon, a place where the air itself smelled of money and the discarded scraps I'd consumed an hour earlier, behind the dumpster in the alley, tasted like bitter ash. My name is Agnes, and at 68 years old, I was a ghost haunting the edges of my son's lavish life, an invisible specter of his past he'd conveniently forgotten. The oyster, I knew, was just the beginning of a very carefully orchestrated meal. The hook, you see, isn't about the oysters or the scraps. It's about the quiet hum of the miniature recording device hidden in the lining of my worn handbag, capturing every clink of cutlery, every dismissive word, every carefully chosen lie. It's about the carefully constructed web of deceit woven by those I once loved, and the even more meticulously crafted plan I had to unravel it. My hands, gnarled with age and arthritic pain, trembled slightly, not from hunger, but from a potent cocktail of anticipation and a cold, slow-burning rage. The waiter, a young man with a pristine white towel draped over his arm, approached our table. His smile was professional, practiced, and held no hint of the storm brewing beneath the surface of my placid demeanor. He offered me a menu, his eyes barely meeting mine, a silent acknowledgement of my second-class status at this table of kings. I politely declined, citing a recent, upset stomach, a believable lie given my age. My son, Michael, barely registered the exchange, already engrossed in his phone, probably scrolling through stock market figures or the latest luxury car models. He was a master of selective blindness, a trait he'd honed to perfection over the years. The detective in me, a dormant part of my soul awakened by betrayal, began its work long before this dinner. It started months ago, with a cryptic phone call from an old friend, a whisper of a name, and a suspicion that had festered into a certainty. My upset stomach wasn't from age. It was from a lifetime of swallowing indignities, a lifetime of sacrificing everything for a son who now saw me as little more than an inconvenience, a relic of a past he preferred to forget. The revenge, a dish best served cold, was already simmering, each ingredient carefully selected, each step meticulously planned. The restaurant, with its polished facade and hidden secrets, was merely the stage. I remembered the day Michael was born. The joy, the overwhelming love, the promises I made to him and to myself. I worked tirelessly, 2 jobs, sometimes 3, to give him every opportunity. Private schools, music lessons, a good university. I saw his ambition, his drive, and I nurtured it, believing it would lead to a better life for both of us. But somewhere along the way, his ambition curdled into something far darker, a ruthless pursuit of wealth that trampled over anyone in its path, including, eventually, me. My story began not with oysters and scraps, but with a small, unassuming inheritance. My late husband, a kind and gentle man, had left me a modest sum, enough for a comfortable retirement, a small house by the sea, a peaceful twilight to my life. It was a dream I'd shared with Michael, a dream he'd enthusiastically endorsed, right before he convinced me to invest it in a brilliant, can't-lose scheme he was developing. It'll double, triple, quadruple, Mom. He'd promised, his eyes alight with a fervor I now recognized as pure avarice. I, foolish old woman that I was, believed him. I handed over every penny, the deed to my house, every last vestige of my security, trusting my son with my future. The investment vanished. Not slowly, not with apologies or explanations, but with a cold, dismissive email. A business setback, he'd called it. A miscalculation. He offered me a small monthly allowance, a pittance that barely covered rent in a cramped, dilapidated apartment on the wrong side of town. When I pressed him, his tone hardened. Mother, you need to understand, this is how business works. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. And besides, I've got my own family to think about now. His family included a new wife, a woman whose diamond solitaire could have paid for my lost retirement 10 times over, and 2 perfectly coiffed children who would never know the meaning of sacrifice. The betrayal was a physical blow. It was a suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest, stealing my breath, stealing my hope. But somewhere in the darkness, a tiny spark ignited. It wasn't despair, it was a quiet, relentless resolve. I wouldn't just fade away. I wouldn't just be another casualty of his ambition. I would fight back, not with anger, but with precision. My first step was to acknowledge the elephant in the room. "Michael," I said, my voice as steady as a calm sea, "these oysters look absolutely delightful. Are they from the Bay of Arcachon?" I made sure to pronounce Arcachon with an exaggerated French flourish, a subtle dig at his often pretentious pronouncements. He looked up, surprised, a flicker of something akin to annoyance crossing his face. He preferred me silent, invisible. My presence was tolerated, not welcomed. "Indeed, mother," he replied, his voice a little too loud, a little too dismissive. "Only the best for my associates." He gestured vaguely at the empty chairs at the table, a pathetic attempt to justify the extravagant reservation for two. I simply smiled, a benign, grandmotherly smile that masked a mind as sharp as a newly honed blade. Over the next hour, as Michael devoured a succession of expensive dishes, pan-seared scallops, a perfectly cooked Wagyu steak, a delicate creme brulee, I sipped on water, occasionally nibbling at a complimentary breadstick. My eyes, however, missed nothing. The way he meticulously cut his steak, almost dissecting it, a reflection of his calculated approach to life. The way he avoided eye contact when talking about his latest deal, a subtle twitch in his left eye giving away his discomfort. The way he occasionally glanced at his watch, eager for the meal to end, eager to be rid of me. My investigation had been slow, painstaking, and often humiliating. I'd spent countless hours at the public library, learning about corporate law, shell companies, and offshore accounts. I'd befriended a retired detective, a gruff but kind man named Frank, who frequented the same soup kitchen I sometimes had to rely on. He saw the fire in my eyes, the quiet determination that belied my frail appearance. Frank, with his network of old contacts and his encyclopedic knowledge of the city's underbelly, became my unlikely confidant and co-conspirator. He'd taught me about tracking money, about following the digital breadcrumbs that even the most meticulous fraudsters leave behind. He'd helped me understand the labyrinthine world of corporate fraud, the subtle ways money could be siphoned off, rerouted, and made to disappear. He'd even helped me acquire the miniature recording device, a tiny marvel of technology that was now quietly documenting Michael's every word. The more I learned, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fit. The business setback wasn't a setback at all. It was a deliberate, calculated theft. Michael had used my investment, not to launch a legitimate enterprise, but to prop up a failing venture, a risky gamble that eventually paid off handsomely, but only for him. He'd restructured his company, creating layers of shell corporations, effectively laundering my money, making it impossible to trace back to him directly. He'd stolen my inheritance, my future, and then had the audacity to offer me scraps. "So, Michael," I said, interrupting his monologue about the merits of a particular vintage wine, "I ran into Mrs. Henderson the other day." Mrs. Henderson was an old neighbor, a kind woman who had always been fond of Michael. She had also been a witness to the initial transfer of my inheritance, a fact Michael had conveniently forgotten. He stiffened, his fork clattering against his plate. "Oh? How's dear Mrs. Henderson?" His voice was laced with a forced pleasantness that grated on my nerves. "She's well," I replied, a small, knowing smile playing on my lips. "She asked after you. And she also mentioned she still has that copy of the old investment agreement we all signed. The one with your original company name on it." Such a meticulous woman, Mrs. Henderson. The color drained from his face. The air in the opulent restaurant suddenly felt thick, heavy. He knew. He knew I knew. The carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. "Mother, that's an outdated document," he stammered, his eyes darting around the room, as if seeking an escape route. "My company has undergone several restructuring phases since then. It's no longer relevant." "Oh, but it is, dear," I purred, my voice still soft, still grandmotherly. "Especially when coupled with certain other documents I've come across." Documents that show a very clear pattern of financial misconduct. Documents that link your current, very successful ventures directly to the investment I made all those years ago. His jaw tightened. The panic was now evident in his eyes, replacing the dismissive arrogance. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment the hunter became the hunted. "What are you talking about, Mother?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. "Are you making accusations?" "Not yet, Michael," I said, leaning forward slightly, my gaze unwavering. "But I have enough evidence, enough paper trails, enough recorded conversations, like this one, for instance, to make a very compelling case to a judge. Or, perhaps, to the financial regulatory authorities." Imagine the headlines, Michael. "Prominent businessman indicted for elder fraud. Son steals from aging mother." Not exactly good for your stock portfolio, is it? He stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. He had underestimated me. He had seen an old woman, frail and easily dismissed. He had forgotten the resilience, the steel that lay beneath the surface. "What do you want, Mother?" he finally whispered, his voice hoarse. "Justice, Michael," I replied, my voice gaining strength, each word a hammer blow. "And everything you stole from me. With interest. And then some." The revenge wasn't just about the money, though that was a crucial part of it. It was about reclaiming my dignity, about showing him that even an old woman, pushed to the brink, could fight back. It was about proving to myself and to the world that I wasn't just a discarded relic. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in negotiation, led by a woman who had spent a lifetime observing, learning, and finally, executing. I laid out my demands: the full return of my inheritance, adjusted for inflation, plus a significant sum for emotional distress, and the immediate transfer of the deed to the small house by the sea that I had always dreamed of. I also demanded a public apology, not just to me, but to the memory of my late husband, whose trust he had so callously betrayed. Michael, trapped and exposed, had no choice but to agree. The recording device in my handbag had captured every incriminating word, every confession, every desperate plea. Frank, my detective friend, had made sure of that. As we left the Gilded Spoon, the moon hung low in the sky, a silent witness to the quiet drama that had unfolded within its gilded walls. Michael, defeated and pale, walked ahead, his usual swagger replaced by a hesitant, almost shuffling gait. I followed, a triumphant ghost finally given form. The open ending, you ask? Well, the story doesn't end with a simple resolution. Justice, as I've learned, is a complex, multifaceted thing. The money will be returned, the house by the sea will be mine, and Michael will face the consequences of his actions, both legal and reputational. But the relationship, the bond between mother and son, is irrevocably broken. The wound of betrayal, once so raw, has scarred over, leaving behind a hard, unyielding surface. I got my revenge, yes. But at what cost? And what happens to a son who has lost not just his wealth, but his mother's love, and perhaps a piece of his own soul? That, my dear reader, is a mystery that only time, and perhaps a dose of self-reflection, can reveal. As I stepped out into the cool night air, a subtle shift in the wind carried a faint scent of something familiar. It wasn't the opulent perfumes of the restaurant patrons, nor the exhaust fumes of passing luxury cars. It was something earthy, primal, a scent that stirred a memory deep within me. I turned, my gaze drawn to the alleyway beside the restaurant, the very spot where I had eaten those discarded scraps just hours before. A shadow detached itself from the gloom, a figure emerging into the faint glow of the streetlights. It was Frank, my grizzled detective friend, a faint, knowing smile on his face. He held up a small, antique silver locket, one that had belonged to my mother, a cherished heirloom I thought I'd lost years ago. "Found this tucked away in the back of the dumpster," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Someone must have dropped it." I took the locket, my fingers tracing the familiar engravings. It was a strange coincidence, finding it now on this night of all nights. A message from the past, perhaps? A reminder that even in the darkest of times, there were always unexpected connections, hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. Thank you, Frank, I said, my voice thick with emotion. He simply nodded, his eyes twinkling in the dim light. Just doing my job, Agnes. Always a pleasure to see justice served, one way or another. He turned to leave, melting back into the shadows from which he had emerged. I stood there for a moment longer, the locket warm in my hand, the cool night air a stark contrast to the fire that still burned within me. The echoes of the night's events, the clinking of oysters, the hushed accusations, the dawning fear in my son's eyes, still reverberated in my mind. But beneath it all, a different sound began to emerge, a quiet hum that was both familiar and unsettling. It was the hum of the recording device, still faithfully capturing the sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the distant traffic, and perhaps the quiet beating of a heart that had finally found a measure of peace. What further secrets would it capture in the days to come? What new mysteries would unfold? The future, much like the ending of my story, remained an open, tantalizing question. The game, I realized, was far from over. And I, Agnes, the grandmother who ate scraps while her son ate oysters, was ready for the next move.
My grandmother told me this story. Thanks for watching this video. Bye bye!